So, if you're taking this class for the first time, there might be some questions that you have after just reading the first half of chapter one. So, you might be wondering what constitutes a culture? Like, if you don't have a strong tie to your ethnicity, does that mean you just don't have a culture? Is sexuality a culture? Is gender a culture? Um, how do we understand and categorize cultures without using stereotypes of those cultures to inform those understandings? So, for the second half of chapter one, we're going to be answering some of those questions so that you have a good baseline going into the rest of the class. And before we start, it's important to understand how intercultural communication emerged as a discipline. So traditionally, we've studied intercultural through a Western lens, meaning that European scholars are the ones who have been telling us what intercultural communication looks like. And basically, we've been studying cultures in places like Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East without taking those perspectives into consideration. So, most of our understanding and the terms and all of the research that has, or not all of it, but a lot of the research that has been done on intercultural communication hasn't really taken into perspective the groups that they're actually studying about, which is kind of wild, right? So that's why in this class, we're going to be taking a critical intercultural lens. And this supplements and sometimes rewrites the Western understanding of culture. And that's actually why I picked this book, because they place a lot of emphasis on looking at intercultural communication critically. As a discipline, there's a lot of things that we can change and rewrite, and that's kind of the beauty of it. And especially if you're a comm major and this topic interests you, and you're like, this is some holes in the research that I think need to be filled, then that might be an area for you to go into in the future, which is pretty cool. And so to learn about intercultural communication in a critical way, we should know what intercultural competence looks like. And intercultural competence is basically how do you become a good intercultural communicator? And the goal of this class is to make you better intercultural communicators. So the way we do that is learning how to be interculturally competent. And that happens by developing three different aspects of communication. The first one is knowledge. So, the more we know about a culture, the less likely we are to rely on stereotypes because we have a more rich and fulfilled understanding of that culture. It's not just like the simple overview of that culture. We know them a little bit more in depth. It also helps us understand our own culture by relating it to others. So the more we know about other cultures, the more we can have that comparison and use that as a baseline to understand ourselves a little bit better. Second is skills. While we might not think of it as one, being empathetic is a skill that takes work and practice. You might be a naturally empathetic person, and that's amazing, but not everyone has that skill. Some people have to really work on that and actively try to incorporate empathy into their everyday lives. Um, and also the ability to use verbal and nonverbal communication, like the language of a culture, is something that's learned and perfected over time. And unfortunately, while you might have all the knowledge in the world about a culture, if you can't execute it with the skills, then that knowledge is kind of not enough, right? You have to be able to actually put that into action. And then the last factor of being interculturally competent is attitude. If you don't have an open-minded or curious attitude, you'll never be a good intercultural communicator, and that's just the bottom line of it, because you don't have the willingness to learn and understand other groups. So you can kind of see how you need all three of these things to be a good intercultural communicator, and all of these factors are interconnected. So, for example, if you don't have the knowledge of other cultures, you can't develop the skills to use that knowledge. And if you don't have an open minded attitude, you're not going to take time to even learn about other cultures in the first place. So, you really need all three of these things to communicate interculturally. And more than any of them, you need the attitude, because without having that natural willingness to learn, you're not even gonna, people who aren't open and don't want to learn about other cultures, they don't even care about having the knowledge or skills because they're closed minded, right? So that's kind of what makes a good intercultural communicator, is these three factors. The next thing we're going to talk about is cultural taxonomies. And so to learn about different cultures, we put them into different categories. And taxonomy is just a fancy word for a category. It's just the way that researchers over the years have noticed these patterns and trends in different cultures. And so they've kind of reduced cultures into these categories that most cultures fit into, or at least lay on a spectrum of these things. And so the first one we'll talk about is individualism versus collectivism. In individualistic cultures, value is placed on being your own distinct, unique self. And in collectivistic cultures, it's more important to be a productive part of how the whole group functions as a whole. For example, let's take two students choosing where to transfer. Let's say they're two students at Mount SAC and they're looking for their 4-year university. A student from an individualistic culture would probably transfer to the best school they got into and be encouraged to do that by their family. It's that achievement culture mentality where it's, this is the best school, I'm going to go there because that's going to give me the best chance of success in life. Versus a student from a collectivistic culture might choose a less competitive school if it meant being closer to their community. And someone from a collectivistic culture also might be more necessary to the functioning of the group. Maybe there's someone that picks up grandma's medicine, or maybe they pick up their siblings from school and watch them after they get out of school, right? And so they're an integral part of the group. And so someone from a collectivistic culture might find it more beneficial to stay close to home, even if that means not going to the best school. And that in their mind is, or that is, their best option. Just like those are two good options, and it just fulfills different needs for those two groups. The second thing we'll talk about is power distance, which describes how comfortable members of a culture are with hierarchies. So basically, if a culture is low power distance, they try to reduce the inequality between people. They want there to be as little power dynamics as possible. But in high power distance cultures, a certain level of inequality is expected, and it's kind of a comfortable part of the culture where there's just a hierarchy. There's some people at the top of the ladder, some people in the middle, and some people on the bottom. And in high power distance cultures, honoring that is important. Let's take the workplace, for example. In a high power distance culture, you're not expected to be friends with your boss because there is a clear power dynamic there. If your boss did something that bothered you, it would be really inappropriate. Actually, it would not even be considered to bring it up, because that's someone who is above you on the ladder. And so they're right no matter what. Someone from a high power distance culture also, they place respect on elders, right? That's someone who has more wisdom and knowledge than you, and so you honor them and respect them in a different way. Low power distance cultures, on the other hand, you have less of that power dynamic. So in the workplace, again, you might feel more comfortable expressing your problems to your boss or your manager. You might go out for drinks with your boss or your manager, and that is kind of more normal, right? Because that power distance doesn't really exist. And there's also less emphasis on respecting people who are older just because they're older, right? And that plays into it as well. The United States is definitely leans more on the low power distance. If you think of, especially in the workplace, you're not necessarily expected to respect your boss or your manager just because they're above you. Like you can ask them questions or question their authority. And there's also less respect placed on elders, at least traditionally and from the research. Next is the monochronic versus polychronic time. And cultures running on polychronic time have a more flexible view of time. And it's not a big deal to be late to something. Time is just a social construct, and things start at a certain time, but that doesn't really mean anything. I think I've mentioned this in a previous PowerPoint, but I am Mexican American, and Latin American countries do run on polychronic time. And if you are from this culture as well, you probably know if a party starts at 4, people are not going to show up until 6, right? That timetable is just a suggestion. It's not necessarily, at least in my experience, right? Can't speak for everyone, but a lot of Latin American countries run on polychronic time. And then monochronic time emphasizes being punctual and being on time. The last category is uncertainty avoidance, which is the degree to which a group is comfortable with the unknown. Some cultures feel more comfortable with predictability than others do, and others feel more comfortable with taking risks, right? And that's just something else that they've kind of come up with to categorize different cultures. So someone from a low uncertainty avoidance where they don't really mind the predict unpredictability of things might be okay with taking a risk on a business, right? Because they don't need that predictable structure in their lives. But big warning, cultural taxonomies can be dangerous, and I will tell you why. While these categories are very helpful, they can also be problematic because um, it's really easy to essentialize different cultures. And essentialism is the assumption that all people from a certain group have the same characteristics. It's basically like when you hear people say, oh, all blank people are like this, right? All of this certain group of people are like this. And that is definitely a problematic way to think. And I'll give you an example. For example, Japan is considered a high power distance culture. But does that mean that everyone from Japan automatically respects every authority figure? Not necessarily. It depends on the person. Every single person is unique. And that's how we end up stereotyping folks and making assumptions about their nature by putting them into categories. So this is just supposed to kind of give you a guide of like what cultures maybe value, but you can't use that to inform your understanding of every single person from that culture. When you reduce cultures down to categories, then we simplify the people in those cultures and they lose the uniqueness and nuances that make them people. So these are just kind of like guides to say these are historically what, from the research, these cultures value. Not every single person is like exactly the same cookie cutter mold that are from this culture. And that's kind of like the big draw that we get from the second half of chapter one is that we can understand culture to a certain extent, but we can't generalize every single person from a culture because we just can't know. There's so many different factors like personality and how someone is raised that affects them as well as their culture. So that's kind of a little bit about a summary of chapter two and some of the important terms and just kind of, or sorry, the second half of chapter one and just kind of breaking it down a little bit more. And if you have any questions, you always know where to reach me, alopez896 at mountsac.edu. Thank you.